Hi, good morning, everybody. Today, in this session, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Indian English poetry. Indian English poetry is the part of Indian English literature. It is also recognized as one of the important parts of world literature for its variety and great themes. I will be giving you some important stages of the development of Indian English poetry in this particular session. To begin with, we will be discussing the very history of Indian English literature, and later we move on to Indian English poetry. As you know, the beginnings are very, very interesting. It is said that the first Englishman to visit India is said to be Cecil in 1883. Of course, by that time the sea route was not discovered. The discovery of the sea route took place in 1498 by Vasco da Gama, with the entry of the Portuguese and the Dutch on this land. The rest we know in the history, that the establishment of East India Company with the permission of Queen Elizabeth I and the Indian Emperor. But gradually, what happened over the years? Earlier, the East India Company intended to only make trade with India, and it had only trading interests. But as the days passed, there were interests in politics, and obviously it resulted in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. We know how the Battle of Plassey is a turning point in the history of India, which augmented the beginning of British rule in India. The victory of Robert Clive in Battle of Plassey wrote the introduction to the British rule in India. In this way, the British interest in the rich history of India began to take place, and they were very much interested in knowing about the country. And there was, of course, on the one hand, the English people wanted to know the history of this country, and they were trying to understand the local literature, Sanskrit literature particularly. On the other hand, some liberal Indians were demanding for English education in this country. As a result, persons like Raja Ram Mohan Roy begin to press forward for the demand for English education in the country. And the famous letter to Lord Amherst in 1827 is a fine example in which he urged for the introduction of English education in the country, particularly the promotion of European learning, and which led to the foundation of Hindu College in Calcutta in 1817. As a result, of course, there was another development, Macaulay's minute on education on 2nd February 1835 is very, very significant, and it was Macaulay who demanded that there should be English education in India. He said it was both necessary and possible to make the natives of the country good English scholars, and that to this end all our efforts ought to be directed. And this was Macaulay's intention to introduce English education in India. And there is a huge debate about Macaulay's minutes and Macaulay's intentions also. I'm not going to talk much about that. And it's because of Macaulay's minute, even he threatened that he would resign if English education is not introduced in this country. And as a result, Lord Bentinck's resolution took place, on the introduction of English education to promote European literature and science in India on 7th March 1835. So with this, we can see the beginning of English education, the beginning of European learning, the beginning of English literature in this country. So we can also see the beginning of English literature, Indian English literature during this period. The first prose writer is said to be Venkataboraya. The account of James in 1803 is said to be the first English prose in India. Rajaram Mohan Rai is also noted for his writing of prose in English, and he was a man who started the magazine, the Brahmanical magazine, which he ran for 3 years, 1821 to 1823. His famous work, The Defense of Hindu Theism, is also important, which was published in 1817. So, with this, I'm moving towards the discussion on Indian English poetry. Indian English poetry, we broadly classify into two important categories: the pre-independence period and the post-independence period. The pre-independence period, the beginning of the English writing in India to 1947, and the post-independence period, whatever poetry is written after the Declaration of Independence, 1947. So this is also called modernist poetry, post-colonial poetry. These broad two categories can be discussed. As I already pointed out that it's going to be just a brief orientation. I may not be able to discuss in detail all the trends, movements, and great poets. I'll be focusing only with my limitations here of time and space. I'll be talking in general about Indian English poetry. The Indian English poetry of pre-independence period is largely imitative. It is said that the beginnings of Indian English poetry, if you see, it's also called period of imitation because they were imitating the British writers. And they were imitating the very idea of British romantic poetry. And they followed Wordsworth, Keats, and they read all about Shelley, Tennyson. The great romantic poets and the Victorian poets were the models, and many Indian writers begin to write romantic poems in the line of romantic writers of 19th century. There were nature poems, there were love poems. And obviously, like the British Romantic poetry, the Indian English poetry, because 19th century is called Age of Enlightenment as far as Indian English literature is concerned, because they were like the Renaissance in 16th century. There was new learning in 19th century, and particularly the European learning, which we call something different from ours. Although Indian literature is very, very rich and varied by this time, it has its own great civilization and wonderful works already written in India. But it was something new, for them. The European literature was something new for them. And the genres developed in English literature, whether it is sonnet, ballad, elegy, ode, they were all borrowed into the Indian English poetry during this time. So the interest in the past, in the earliest poetry shows the interest in the past. And there is myth and history. Largely, we were talking about the Ramayana, Mahabharata, wonderful stories that India is known for. The history of India, it has its own history. and long history and wonderful heroes, legends. They were also a part of, and you can also see in the beginning some translations of the Indian text into English. And that's normally you see when English is studied as a foreign language or a second language. And that was a kind of necessity, because by that time Indian literature was already rich, and they tried to translate Indian text into English for two reasons. One, to tell the external world that Indian literature is rich and varied, and the other actually and is to try the Indian themes in English through translations. So the major poets of this particular pre-independence period are Henry Deroggio, who is known for his book of poetry, The Fakir of Jangira, and M.M. Dutt, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, The Captive Lady, which is in fact the story of Prithviraj Chauhan and his captive lady, which led to the fierce battle. In the history, you know the story of Prithviraj Chauhan. The publication of that family album in 1870 is again a very important landmark in the history of Indian English poetry. It's a very peculiar kind of development that we see the family album produced. We talk about the Turtle's Miscellany in English literature, that here that family album, which was published in 1870, contains 187 poems by three brothers, Govind Chandra Dutt, Har Chandra Dutt, and Grish Chandra Dutt, and their cousin Umesh Chandra Dutt. It's a very interesting thing that they try to write about Indian themes, and that was the whole family committed to literature. And that's a very interesting contribution by that family. And with this, we move to the next important poet of pre-independence period is Toru Dutt, the first great Indian poetess. We may call her the Keats of India for two reasons. Her poetry is so sweet and wonderful. At the same time, she too died very young, like John Keats. So she would have produced a greater poetry had she lived for a long time. She is, of course, born into a very cultured family. And Govind Chandra Dutt, we already discussed him as one of the Dutt brothers who produced poetry. And Toru is Toru Lata, her original name, and later she became Toru Dutt. She traveled to France and England, and she wrote wonderful poems. A sheep gleamed in French fields, which contains 165 lyrics. And another book is Ancient Ballads, and yet another collection is Legends of Hindustan. We see in Toru Dutt's poetry that kind of a sweetness and romantic strain. There is nostalgia in the poems like Or Kazurina Tree. There is something about Indian myths like Savitri, Lakshmana, Sita. She tried to, of course, write about the major characters in Indian mythology, Indian, epics. So that's a very interesting part of Toru. Toru's poems are also known for, wonderful presentation of nature, imagination, and the emotional appeal. That is the greatness of Toru Dutt. And we move on to Manmohan Ghosh, who is the elder brother of Aravind Ghosh, whose Primavera is an important collection of poems. Love Songs and Elegies was also written by Manmohan Ghosh. And next important person is Aravind Ghosh. Aravind is a great saint. We remember Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry, Auroville, and he was the greatest of Indian English poets. a great versifier in English, known for a very strong, um, classical knowledge. He was a patriot, a poet, yogi, and seer, and a person with a great vision. And that's Aurobindo. We call him Maharshi Aurobindo. The greatest work of Aurobindo is obviously Savitri. The greatness of Savitri is that it's one of the longest epics in Indian English poetry. To tell about its importance, it is 23,813 lines. It is written in 12 books, 49 cantos. Aurobindo almost took 50 years to complete this work. It is said that it is twice the size of Milton's both the epics, that is Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. So he proved to be one of the greatest epic poets in the world, because he had that ability to write epic poetry. And the story of Satyavana and Savitri, which is a part of a Mahabharata also, which also deals with his very idea of the life divine, how Savitri wins over the death and how she protects her husband. In this particular epic, he speaks about the very idea of life divine. And Aurobindo is also known for his other works like future poetry and wonderful prose Aurobindo produced in his lifetime. The next great poet, and the poet who brought global recognition to Indian English literature, as Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore is a multifaceted personality, a wonderful man of imagination, wonderful thinker, a poet, a playwright, a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, philosopher, educationist, thinker, musician, painter, freedom fighter, and a great humanist also. You know, um, he is a man who was also both a nationalist and internationalist. So in that way, Tagore is such a wonderful, multi-dimensional, multifaceted personality. You know, Gandhi called him the great sentinel, Gurudev Tagore. You know, and it is Tagore who called Gandhi Mahatma, the great soul. So the important works, of course, you all know, Gitanjali is what we call the song offerings, originally written in Bengali and translated into English, which won great applause from great poets like W.B. Yeats. You know, that is also responsible for his Nobel Prize award. But it's not just Gitanjali, which is responsible for his great name. He wrote plays, novels, short stories, and wonderful other collections like The Crescent Moon, Fruit Gathering, Stray Birds, Lovers Gift, and Crossing, A Fugitive. As everyone knows, he's the first Indian to be awarded Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. So this is a brief introduction about Tagore. The next Indian poet of recognition is Sarojini Naidu, originally a Bengali, and it just came down to South India after her marriage with Naidu, and she became Sarojini Naidu. And she was writing in the style of the British Romantic poets, nature poems in imitation of British Romantics. It was during this time she was advised by poets like Edmund Gosse to write on Indian themes. And it's because of this we see the turning point in her literary career, and she began to write about Indian themes, Indian culture, And obviously, her works like the Golden Threshold, the Bird of Time, the Broken Wing, and the Scepter Flute deals with the Indian life and portrayal of Indian society through her poems. Uh, the famous to remember Indian weavers, palanquin bearers, bazaars of Hyderabad, the Song of Krishna, a wonderful presentation of Indian society is found in her poems. And with this, of course, there are many other poets because of the paucity of the time and, of course, space here. I'm moving on towards the post-independence poetry. And in this particular section, we'll be discussing how there is a change. Of course, it's not now the period of imitation. The British rule is over. India was declared independent in 1947. It also influenced the literature of the time, the independent thinking. So naturally, you can see the experiments with the new techniques, new genres, both in style and stance. You can see the change in Indian English poetry. That's why we call this modernist poetry. Okay, so they just came out from the shackles and they try to experiment with new themes and techniques. And the focus is also on social realism, the portrayal of post-independent Indian society. And there are modernist elements, use of free verse. There is no, restriction on these, particular metrical device. Whatever. So the important among them are Nissim Ezekiel, the famous Indian English poet of post-independence period. He belongs to Bene Israeli family, and there is a theme of alienation in his poems and the picture of Indian society. Of course, his famous collections are A Time to Change, 60 Poems, The Unfinished Man, The Exact Name, Hymns of Darkness. And we remember whenever we talk about Nissim Ezekiel, we remember The Night of the Scorpion, we remember his poem, A Goodbye Party to Miss Pushpa T.S., um, uh, the great Indian poem in Indian English. Uh, there is wit and humor. There is a kind of a mild satire. And that's why Nissim Ezekiel is always remembered for his wonderful presentation of Indian English in his poems. The next to remember is Dom Morris. Dom Morris is often remembered for his autobiography, the title My Son's Father. It's an interesting title he has given to his autobiography. Of course, as a poet, he is known for his beginning and John Nobody. Of course, um, that's a different kind of a man, actually. He was also influenced by Stephen Spender and wrote modernist poetry. P. Lal is known for starting writers' workshop in Kolkata. And he's the man who tried to, in fact, give a shape to Indian English poetry, who brought out collections of poems. He was a great organizer also. That way, his contribution to Indian English poetry is more as an organizer and, guide. His famous poems are Draupadi and Jayadratha and A Man of Dharma. And other writers we should remember here is Adil Jasuwala's Missing Person and A.K. Ramanujan, who is from Karnataka, actually, a bilingual writer both in Kannada and English. He was a poet, translator, and a folklorist. And he wrote the Indian folk tales, and his contribution to Indian poetry, Indian folklore is immense. He lived in America, and he was born in Karnataka, and he wrote wonderful poems, The Striders, The Interior Landscape. His wonderful poems are small-scale reflections on great Indian house, a river which speaks about Madurai, and other poems like Obituary. We remember again the presentation of Indian society, what he knew, about his family and during his stay in India during the early days of his life. A.K. Ramanujan's contribution is very significant to modern Indian poetry. There are, of course, wonderful writers. Nandi, and British Nandi is famous for, he was a great orator, a politician, and more than that, as an orator, we remember him in the British Nandi show on Doordarshan. Wonderful speaker of English, and he's known for his poem, the first collection of poems of Gods and Olives. And Keke and Dharwala's under Orion, apparition in April, crossing of the rivers, as a significant work. Shuke Kumar is a great poet. His articulate silences, cobwebs in the sand, subtle approaches, woodpeckers. And Jayant Mahapatra is mainly a Orissa writer, represents the Orissa society. And we come to know about various aspects of Odisha society. In his poems, Close the Sky, 10 by 10, A Rain of Rights, a number of poems are about, Indian society. Arun Kolatkar, if Mahatpatra belongs to Odisha, Arun Kolatkar belongs to Maharashtra. The Jajuri is a very famous collection in which he writes about, Khandoba temple in Maharashtra, and the life around is beautifully described. His famous poem, An Old Woman, is interesting. Kamala Das is remembered for her wonderful poems. In fact, she was the very important modern English poet. For her, her poetry is famous for the frankness of expression, compassional tone. She is, of course, a bilingual writer, wrote both in Malayalam and English. She's also known as Kamala Suraya, and she is also famous for her autobiography, My Story. And her important poetical works are The Summer in Calcutta, The Descendants, The Old Playhouse, and other poems. We remember her poems like An Introduction, which is very, known for its direct, plain tone, and it's partly autobiographical, and her other poems like My Grandmother's House. We consider Kamala Das as an important contributor to Indian English poetry. So, with this, of course, I'm going to close our discussion on Indian English poetry. It doesn't mean that there are no other poets. There are a number of poets which I'm not able to cover in short time. There are many poets who wrote recently. The contemporary Indian English poets are not included in this discussion. We will be talking about the remaining English poets in the later sessions. With this, I'm going to stop my brief introduction on Indian English poetry. Thank you so much.